remember around the time of George Floyd, when that whole situation happened, where there was some talks going around saying things like, Islam doesn't have a place in this conversation. I was right with them up until that point. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good, sis. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, good.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So today we are back with a new Revert series, Inshā'Allāh. If you didn't watch the last video, it was about the expectations that new Muslims have, should have, etc. I'll link that in the description of the video, Inshā'Allāh. Today's episode 2, and we are going to be speaking about culture, Inshā'Allāh. So I've called it, because I'm not too creative with the titles, but I called it Culture versus Being Muslim.
Okay, I think that's good.
Yeah, I was going to write culture versus reverts, but to be honest with you, I think this is a topic for everybody.
Of course, absolutely.
Even though we're going to be having like a sort of revert take on it, and we're going to be advising reverts, new Muslims, etc. But yeah, this is definitely a reminder for everybody, Inshā'Allāh. Now, with culture comes pros and comes cons, and hopefully we'll try and touch on everything. But I thought maybe it would be beneficial if we started with a positive. What positives do you think can come from observing different cultures as a Muslim?
Just this morning I seen some Brazilian family, apparently they became Muslim since going to the World Cup in Qatar. The media have done its best to try to make Qatar look like, the world's biggest villains because, X and Y, Z reasons. A lot of people have gone there and had really positive experiences so far. Because we know that, a lot of different Muslim cultures, they have this really great hospitality, treating you well, making sure that your needs are taken care of. Generally, they go out of their way to make sure that you don't leave their house hungry, for example, and how Muslims try their best to make people feel like welcomed and taken care of in general. That's been my experience, even before I became Muslim. It's one of the things, alhamdulillah, I always felt relaxed if I went to a Muslim's house. And I knew I wouldn't come home hungry either. Do you know what I mean? So that's always a bonus too. Do you know what I mean? And food, we know, is a big deal in a lot of cultures, and is something that can bring people together, if that makes sense. You're invited to be part of that family, for that meal or whatever. There's different things that you can talk about, so it can gauge your interest in different things in the way that people do things in their homes. So these people, alhamdulillah, this particular family, I don't know the ins and outs. I just seen a little clip, something like a photo this morning. But yeah, they said they became Muslim after having good experience in the Qatar, and I don't know exactly what it was that made them feel that they would accept Islam, the whole family. But alhamdulillah, they obviously in Qatar they made a lot of effort to do dawah and things like that, around the place and everything. So yeah, I think the hospitality thing is a big deal. This is something that Muslims definitely are well known for.
I totally agree with you. I think the hospitality is a huge thing when it comes to Muslims. I don't think I've came across any Muslim culture yet that hasn't sort of shown that. Obviously, that is an Islamic principle. It does come from Islam, but definitely Muslims know how to make a spread, whether it's a Desi spread or a North African spread or an East African spread or a Middle Eastern spread.
Yeah, don't make me hungry.
Sorry. But definitely, they definitely know how to make people feel welcome. And, that was my first experience of Muslim, that sort of behaviour and character, how a group of people made you feel, and when we were sort of planning this talk, you mentioned your sense of belonging, and I think that's what Muslims are really good at the majority of the time, is giving people this sense of belonging, especially when it comes to being invited into their spaces. I think the reason why I was thinking about this question, what is the positives that come with observing Muslim cultures as a new Muslim, is just because, you have an opportunity to see how a culture nurtures a person's Islam. Now, obviously, we're going to get into the cons, so I'm just totally focusing on the positives. But it is interesting to see in terms of how they raise their kids, in terms of the setups within their communities. For me, in my experience, culture really taught me how people take Islam and apply it to their life.
It's the practical implementation, isn't it?
Yeah, and how their culture can be a part of that in a beautiful
Hmm.
and positive way. Like when we were speaking about hospitality, like it's a very Scottish thing to, go to someone's home with a gift. Like you can't go like
Hmm.
the minimum you can go
Hmm.
with is like a packet of biscuits. That's the
Yeah.
minimum.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and if anybody looks like they're in need, it is like impulsive to help. Also, if you're standing at a bus stop, it's like normal to say hi to a stranger.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, when I became Muslim and I saw the characteristics of a Muslim and the behavior of Muslims and how the rights of one Muslim to another, there was moments in my culture where I was like, this is an Islamic principle. This is also an Islamic principle. And, it did eventually, it wasn't something that came very quickly, but eventually I did start to see how my own culture and my own identity can be a Muslim just as much as the next person. Does that make sense? Or the next Muslim with their
Yeah,
own culture.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think that you raised a really important point there. I like that because it just made me think as well of shortly after I became Muslim, I moved to Newcastle and or Newcastle, right? And one of the things that I loved about it is just that I could see, like, without knowing anybody there, the way that family was extremely important to people. We see, like, especially fathers, it wouldn't be like just mothers with their kids, fathers with the children, sometimes with the mother, sometimes without the mother, but you see three generations of a family together, grandparents, the parents and the grandchildren. And this is something it's a staple in that city particularly, and it's one of the things that made me really love the place as well. And another thing was, when you walk out in the morning especially, and you meet people on the street, they will say good morning regardless of who you are. They don't know you, but they will say good morning. And I really loved that because we know as Muslims that when we meet other Muslims, we should greet them with salam, which obviously they're not saying assalamu alaikum, but they're greeting people. It makes you
Yeah,
feel like you're part of them, like you're part of that place, even if
yeah,
you don't personally know that person. And I think
yeah,
these are really beautiful characteristics, which, as I said, every culture has good in it. When you're coming from a non-Muslim background and you observe the Muslims and how they practice Islam, and you start to see these, little things here and there, especially when it comes to, hospitality and, how to treat people in your community. You can see from your own background or your own upbringing the Islamic principles that are already there. This is how we treat people in a hospitable way. This is how we, show that we care for people and, try
yeah,
to look after each other, because Islam is a universal religion. People,
yeah,
may not realize
absolutely.
that, but when you become
They
a Muslim,
don't, yeah.
this is one of the key things. You don't need to become an Arab. You don't need to become an Asian or African or whatever. You don't need to become something other than what you are. You will find that there's plenty of Islamic principles already part of your culture. So
And
the ones that are good, and you keep those, and obviously anything that in your culture that isn't Islamic, that's what you drop,
you
and that goes
discard.
across the board.
Absolutely, 100% can agree more. And that's sort of the thing. I think that's why it was so important that we had this conversation, because culture versus a new Muslim is a thing. Some people think that they have to completely strip themselves and adopt, a sort of Muslim culture, and they go in on that hard, so much so that they end up sort of losing themselves and losing their identity, and then going through this sort of identity crisis mid-reversion. What do you think the negatives are in terms of the blurred lines between people practicing their culture and practicing Islam?
Well, the things that come into my mind are probably mostly related to maybe marriage and women's issues. For example, in like the Southeast Asian culture, we know that Hindus have a practice that's like, when you get married, the daughter, her family is the one that's supposed to give the dowry, for example.
Mhm,
So you'll find
mhm.
that some Muslims still have this as a practice, even
Yeah.
though it's the other way in Islam. It's the man that's supposed to give the dowry, and it doesn't go to the family of the girl, it goes to the girl herself. When people think about dowry from the Western concept, they think of it as like, oh, it's like you're selling your daughter. But in Islam, the man is supposed to give the mahar to the girl directly. It's not for her family, it's for her
Yeah.
specifically. The Hindu culture, as I said, is completely the opposite way, where the girl's family themselves, they have to pay this other family to, like, basically take their daughter on, along those lines. And and that's another reason why some of those cultures, it's looked down on. If you have girls, it's seen as a burden, because it's just like,
Yeah.
it's going to be more
Yeah.
expensive for you,
And
whereas
there
having
was
a boy is going to be better and easier, because he's the one that's
yeah.
going to make money for the family, basically.
One of the first things that the Prophet ﷺ
So
addressed before Islam, it was
mhm.
very much a part of their culture to bury their newborn daughters, because they were seen as a burden. And not only that, there was a story I remember not that long ago, maybe last year or the year before, where there was this Muslim sister from the region that you spoke about earlier, who didn't give you know, an appropriate dowry to her husband, and she got shamed to the point where she ended up committing suicide. And, you know,
SubhanAllah.
culture definitely has a place and can be a really beautiful thing. But if it's taking you down these sort of avenues, if it's prioritizing that before Islam, then you have a problem.
That's what happens when people have a lack of knowledge as well, you know. So this is one of the other downsides, you could say, with being raised in a Muslim culture, when people, they learn from the people around them, but they don't have like a formal type of learning, where it's, as you know, I mentioned in the last episode, any new Muslim, like when you're learning about Islam, you need to look at Islamic references to back up whatever you're being taught, to know that this is actually from the religion itself. It could be that their community is doing something which isn't correct Islamically at all, doesn't have any basis in Islam, but because, you know, the people are praying 5 times a day and doing the, you know, the main pillars that they should be doing, they, you know, automatically, they never question it. Do you know what I mean? Every Muslim has that responsibility to, you know, seek the knowledge in an appropriate manner, in a correct way, not just to rely on other people, especially people who don't have that level of Islamic education as well. You know, maybe the way you're praying is even incorrect. You know, you could have mistakes in your salah. Like, how would you know that you're doing your salah correctly? And that's why we need to take time to actually study these things formally, so that we can know like exactly how the Prophet ﷺ prayed.
Obviously, we would advise that the new Muslim go to people and be around people, like you mentioned, go to the mosque and learn through the people and their actions. But at some stage, that is where it would lead to. It is important that you know where your practice is coming from, because mistakes are made by people, and at some point you have to be independent in your practice, and a part of that is knowing where your practices are coming from. Are you doing them right? Are you following, like you said, the way of the Prophet ﷺ? You shouldn't want anything less than that. I definitely didn't revert to become half Muslim or half practice or today anything halfway. You know, like, it takes time and everything, but that definitely should be your priority. What is your experience, you know, as a new Muslim or as a revert with other Muslim cultures?
Well, I would say it's been generally very positive. Even before being Muslim, I was always mixing with people of different cultures anyways. And even my family background is like mixed culture as well. You know, one of my parents is African, the other is from the Caribbean. And there's some differences in culture there as well. So, you know, I'm used to growing up with people from different places and different cultures. You know, I had Irish neighbors growing up, Indian neighbors, and, you know, we was quite close as families, you know, living in the same building. I'm interested in different cultures and, you know, find them appealing in different ways. You know, I mean, I like seeing the differences that people have between them, the things that are common, and having this kind of maybe analytical eye where you can see, well, actually, the more you study people, the more you realize we're not that different as much as we actually think, you know, with more in common than less in common. So, alhamdulillah, I think, it's been generally positive. That's what I can say. I mean, obviously there's negative things, but it's few and far between for me anyways. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think for me, somewhere along the line, and I probably think it was during a time where I was taking a dip anyway, like my Iman was taking a hit, like as my family was growing, I was having less time to sort of focus on my Islamic studies. So I think it's always the beginning of the decline, you know, when you are not prioritizing your learning and increasing your knowledge, generally, whether Revert or not, like that's the beginning of the decline, you know. And I think somewhere in that, the pressure of other cultures, I think they started to have an impact on how I see myself. To some extent, I felt like I had lost myself to a degree, as cringy as that sounds, but I was sort of questioning myself, like, you know, for example, my kids will call themselves, you know, Somali before they'll call themselves Scottish, which is fine. My oldest, he's a huge football fan. My dad bought him a Scotland football top. I started to notice that he wouldn't wear it as often, or he wouldn't wear it in certain situations. He was sort of made to feel embarrassed about wearing that top because it's not his dad's culture. This white Scottish side was an embarrassment. That I used to sort of brush off as banter. But eventually, as my kids got older and I could start to see that it was getting to his psyche, like that sort of got to me, you know.
If you're raising children who are mixed race, I don't actually like that term because we're not half jinn, right? But anyways, human beings. So, but if you make them rich in, if you're basically raising children who are mixed cultured, let's say, right, it's important that they know that, especially being a Muslim, our culture is Islam. Okay, so whatever doesn't fall into Islam, you can toss that to the side. And, you know, everything else you keep it. So my house has always been a mixed, you know, family house. You know, I'm happy for my kids that want to call themselves Moroccan or whatever, all this kind, and I encourage them with that. But they also know that they're also African Caribbean as well. Do you know what I mean? And they embrace both sides of their cultures. They don't have any issue being both, and nobody has any right to make them feel embarrassed. You need to raise your children to embrace that. So I think you're not less than somebody because you come from a different culture. Because this is where racism comes in. It's one of my pet peeves, honestly. I think I just need to talk a whole episode just on this. But in the Muslim community, I've seen across the board where there's a lack of respect for Western culture. So anybody who happens to be white coming from a Western culture, they're looked at as like, oh, well, you're the people who've already lost your culture. And definitely that's true to some extent. We know that. However, it doesn't mean that those people coming into Islam from that background are less than, or that there's certain things in their culture which should not be accommodated for or accepted, because the reality is they still have things that come and fall within Islamic principles. And you with your African background or Arabi background or Indian background or whichever Muslim country you come from, you also have things in your culture that you need to toss against the wall and completely smash to pieces, because it's destroying Islam from within. People are getting the wrong idea about Muslims because you've got things in your culture which are completely against Islam. So this is where people need to try to come and meet in the middle and stop looking at each other as, well, my culture is more superior to yours because we have more values and we have more principles. Oh, but you've got a lot of things that's messed up in your culture. Why are your women so desperate to run to the West? Why are your women, so many of your women, desperate to marry a white man then? Because they think that their lives are going to be better if they marry a white man. They're going to be respected in general. Do you see what I mean? It's because you have left off those things which are Islamic, and that's why a lot of your people in your culture are seeking something else, because you haven't been practicing Islam in its entirety. So we shouldn't look down on other people's cultures, and especially when it comes to small things like this, and belittling people like over a t-shirt, over a flag that doesn't have any issues Islamically. I remember I have a distant relative, and I remember I visited her once, and she's from Barbados. Her husband happened to be Pakistani. And I remember when I went to her house, and this was before I became Muslim, but I was really just in love with everything about their family. I just thought it was amazing. Alhamdulillah, they had a beautiful home. And, I remember when I went to their kids' rooms, I noticed they had a Pakistani flag there, and they had the Barbados flag. And I thought that was really wow. I was just cool. These children are being raised to embrace both sides of their culture. Do you know what I mean? They're not being told you're this one and you need to ignore the other. You can be both, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody's mixed at the end of the day. But with all the DNA testing that is available now, people are doing their ancestry checks and stuff like that. People are finding that they have roots in parts of the world that they never would have imagined. Do you know what I mean? So it just goes to show none of us, there's no pure anything. We are the human race. Okay,
there's so many points you made that I agree with. I think that two different cultures have the ability to come together, and the ability and even the beauty of coming together if they have their Islamic priorities straight. If they don't, then this is where the mess happens. This is where the injustice happens. We have been planning to do a whole episode on race, and I suppose we might be able to touch on it here. But I think,
to be honest, you can't not talk about culture without mentioning race, though, isn't it? The two of them do kind of go together. We don't need to go all the way in.
I think for me, what's important is that race, culture, ethnicity, status in terms of class, all these things are secondary to us being Muslim. I know that sometimes in some areas that's an unpopular opinion.
If people don't have that opinion, then they're just wrong, full stop. There was this video going around where this girl, I think she was maybe, I don't know, she's from an African background, I think Eastern African, but she, living in America, and her mum, she must have asked her mum, are you black first or are you Muslim first? And the mother said, I'm Muslim first. And she goes, oh no, well, I'm black first. And it's just your blackness or your whiteness or your yellowness or whatever color you want to call yourself, it's not going to do a damn thing for you in your grave, babes. So you can talk about being black first, but when you're in your grave and the angels are questioning you, they're not going to ask you about your complexion, and they're not going to ask you about, anything to do with your culture. They're going to ask about your deen.
You know what? Not only that, I remember around the time of George Floyd, when that whole situation happened, there was a lot of talk around systematic racism, and all of that has its place, has its importance, is real in some areas more than others, etc., etc. But I remember there was some talks going around saying things like, Islam doesn't have a place in this conversation. And for me, I was right with them up until that point. As soon as you say Islam doesn't have a place in the solution to a societal issue.
Yeah, exactly. That's just completely wrong. This is what happens when people just put their emotions before their common sense. You as a Muslim are going to sit down and say that Islam is not the solution to racism. Then you are rejecting Islam in principle. You are rejecting it. You have the audacity to even say that Islam doesn't have a place in the conversation. You need to take a sit down, because we know that whatever cultures that we come from, whatever our skin color happens to be, these are different tests that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala
absolutely
tests, blessings, situations. Everybody's coming from their own different perspective, their own different kind of, set of parameters where, you know, they've had to navigate through in life. And, you know, as a Black woman, yes, I will have challenges that other people may never experience just because of my skin color. This does not mean that Islam is not the answer to my problems in life. You can easily fall into victim mentality. And I believe that, you know, Islam is something that frees you from having a victim mentality. Do you know what I mean? It's like when people ask the question, oh, how do I know if I'm being punished or if I'm being tested? Do you know what I mean? So if we have this victim mentality as Black people specifically, that, oh, because I'm Black, this is why this happened and this is why this happened, and you make it the measure of everything negative that's happened in your life. It might not be because of that, but it's like you're making your skin color a punishment for yourself rather than a test. Whatever Allah's going to give you is never going to escape from you. Do you know what I mean? So we need to have this mentality where we understand and accept that whatever we get in life is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever challenges that we have in life, these are tests and trials from Allah. And we as Muslims use Islam as our way of navigating through those challenges, regardless. For example, South Sudanese people, go and talk to them about how they've experienced racism in their communities from other Black people and being called all sorts of names and being made to feel like they were the bottom of the barrel by other Black people who happen to not be as dark as them. You know, so having this superiority complex. So children who have, for example, a white parent and a Black parent, go and talk to those children and see how they've struggled growing up. Like they've had their own experience, which is unique because of that mixed cultural heritage as well. Mental sickness and disease, which only Islam can eradicate.
Across the board as well, some are like, whether it's racism, whether it's classism, whether it's nationalism, no, I stand against all that compromises their Muslim being. And we do have a lot of that. We do have a lot of classism within the Muslim community. We do have a lot of racism within the Muslim community. We do have a lot of nationalism, colorism within the Muslim community. But like you said, Islam is always the solution to that. If you were to give a revert or a new Muslim advice on how to embrace their culture or find their own identity within their Muslim self and their culture, like what sort of advice would you give?
Well, basically, you just need to know that you don't have to change like who you are, like culturally, specifically, in order to be a Muslim or to be accepted as a Muslim. And nobody should expect that of you. And if anybody does, then those kind of people, I wouldn't waste time spending with them. Basically, when you enter your journey in Islam, the least distractions that you have, the better. And I think that cultural stuff can really become something that bog people down and make people feel like they're not getting something right just because they don't happen to be fitting in this particular box, because Islam isn't about being in a box. You know what I mean? It's about freeing your mind and elevating yourself in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's about you as a person nurturing your soul and just going to that next level all the time, trying to progress and be better each day. Culture may or may not help you do that. Keep your culture, but whatever your culture has, which is un-Islamic, drop it. So like, you know, for example, if in your culture, the main dish that you have, your national dish of your country, whatever happens to be, you know, pork roast, then, you know, you need to drop that. Do you know what I mean? Definitely. And that happens. Like it doesn't mean you can't have that bacon rashes in the morning, but it got to be turkey bacon. That's what I'm saying. The halal turkey bacon. Get down the halal shop and have that. But you can still have that English breakfast or whatever breakfast that you're commonly, you know, that you like eating. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to become somebody who loves curry overnight. You don't need to become somebody, or ever actually. You don't need to become somebody who, you know, can sit down and eat a pot of chili.
I think we're really lucky in the UK because whenever I speak to Americans, like a lot of them tell me that trying to just even access halal meat is sometimes difficult in some places, you know. So I think in the UK we're really, really fortunate to have a Muslim community who has created businesses where we're able to access these things. Like I have a whole thing here, like we have square sausage here, right, which unfortunately you as Southsiders haven't had the luxury of trying unless you've been here, right?
Wow, I've never even heard of it. A square sausage?
Square sausage,
sausages, you know. Oh my God.
Some people call it slice, but we Glaswegians call it square sausage, right? And it doesn't look very appetizing, but my gosh, is it amazing.
I'm sure it's yummy.
It is, honestly.
Work something out here, man. I've got to get some food chips. I've got to get some food chips from Scotland.
You need to come. You're always welcome, sis. You're always welcome, you know that. But yeah, no, but see, when I first reverted, they didn't have square sausage. They didn't have it. And I remember, I don't know how long into my reversion, but it would have been a good 5 or 6 years, something like this. And I remember visiting from London and finding halal square sausage, and let me tell you, I don't think I've ever been so grateful for the Muslim community in Glasgow for such provision, the fact that I could have an actual Scottish fry up, the full shebang with apart from the turkey rashers, you know. So yeah, no, and it was amazing. So definitely there is a lot to appreciate, and I suppose that came from the Muslim community within here who do come from different cultures, appreciating the Scottish culture,
Exactly.
recreating so that they themselves could try it and adopt it within their household.
Exactly.
And that
And
is
these are the
the
positive things
beauty.
that can come from mixing as well.
Exactly. This is the beauty of, and this is the thing, you know, that I've had some criticism in the past because for me, my channel, it has Scottish in it and I appear very nationalistic, but and I'm going to say this and people might disagree, but any more research into Scotland and you'll understand what I mean. But Scottish nationalism is not the same because it is like a part of our core to embrace people. Alhamdulillah, we pride ourselves on that as a nation, alhamdulillah, you know. A lot of beauty that we can see within our own culture, within the mixing of cultures, if we just strip ourselves for the politics, the ego, the bias, you know, like, and this is what we're trying to do as Muslims. We're trying to perfect our characters, inshallah. But yeah, embracing your food as long as it's halalified, embracing, you know, even your garments as long as they are
Yes.
halalified, they fulfill the conditions of hijab. You know, live your best life. You know, don't apologize for you being born a certain colour, born for a certain country, born in a certain class. This is all for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have to be grateful for all it, you know, and we need to be a part of the solution or solutions as Muslims. Again, the beauty of Islam, you know, there's a hadith, famous hadith that says, you know, you're not a believer unless you want for your brother what you want for yourself. And this is something that we are, and this is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are very fortunate to have a sisterhood and a brotherhood and an ummah. I know 100% that I'm so appreciative of you, Sister Summer.
And yeah. Literally, I feel the same, alhamdulillah.
So yeah, I think that's probably the best we're going to do in this conversation on this topic. But I mean, it is a broad topic. We could go into it so much, couldn't we? We could talk for hours about this, but we'll try and spare the people from that. Plus, I have to pick up my kid in half an hour. So that being said, I hope you all benefit from this conversation. I know I'm taking away some golden nuggets, inshallah.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.